And when it does that, it creates a low pressure area, and your airplanes get in that deal, and down it goes. And I know one time I had a biologist, and she kept wanting to get down closer, and I told her I didn't think it was a good idea, but I would try it. So I came down and got down below the ridge, and all of a sudden I had pencils floating on the ceiling. And I just came right on down the canyon and headed home, and she says, "I'm not done." And I said, "Yeah, I am." So.
Oh, man. These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. The Six Ranch Podcast is brought to you by Sig Sauer. SIG is a leading provider and manufacturer of firearms, electro-optics, ammunition, air guns, and suppressors. For over 250 years, Sig Sauer Inc. has evolved and thrived by blending American ingenuity, German engineering, and Swiss precision. Today, Sig Sauer is synonymous with industry-leading quality and innovation, which has made it the brand of choice amongst the U.S. military, the global defense community, law enforcement, competitive shooters, hunters, and responsible citizens. Sig Sauer is also a premier provider of elite firearms instruction and tactical training at the Sig Sauer Academy located in New Hampshire. For more information about Sig Sauer and its complete line of products, visit sigsauer.com. What was the first airplane you ever flew?
That I flew in or flew?
Both.
Well, the first airplane I flew in was about a 1950 Stinson.
And what is the Stinson?
Stinson's an airplane that was pretty popular back around in the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
There's still quite a few around. It was the one I flew in was a four-place airplane that a guy in Enterprise owned it, and he had a little flying service. His name was Ray Dunsmore. And what I've been told, and I don't know if this is true, but that's what I was told, is that he learned to fly during World War One. The war was over before he ever left the country for combat, but there was a lot of fellows that learned to fly in World War One. And so anyway, after that, the choices were to find some other line of work or go barnstorming or whatever. Anyway, he ended up working for the Ford Motor Company, and I was told that he ended up out west to help set up car dealerships. And so he got to know the West pretty good. And so Ray ended up settling in Enterprise, and he and his wife, they raised a daughter. And in fact, I think he and his wife are buried there at Enterprise Cemetery. But anyway, he was still flying when I was about 5 years old. And my dad had a haying crew, and he told him, he says, "Well," he said, "you guys done a really good job. We're going to take you all for a plane flight over the valley." So they hired Ray to do that. And so on the second flight, I got to go along, and I sat on my dad's lap. Probably not legal, but I was 5 years old. I can remember sitting there watching the rudder pedals move back and forth as we're taking off and landing. And then flying over our home, you could see all the cows, and they looked really small. And I remember flying over Wallow Lake and back to Enterprise. And so that pretty well hooked me for wanting to fly.
So what year would that have been?
I think that was 1954.
Okay.
The summer of 54.
Gotcha.
And so I was 5 years old. And so the neighbors, a couple of the neighbor boys were working for my dad at that time, helping put hay up. It used to take quite a few more people to put hay up than it does today. And so then the next memory I have of airplanes, I was watching from our place. I could see this ag plane down there spraying in what is now belongs to James. And that was probably the same summer. And I took off looking because I was going to get close, and had my folks rather concerned. And when I got back, my grandmother, I remember this very plainly, taking a rope and tying me to a tree because she said that's what we do with runaway dogs. So that was kind of what I wanted to do. Always had that dream, but I didn't know how to go about learning or anything after I got out of high school. I didn't realize they had a flying club even. So, but I knew a couple of guys that flew and had flown with them. And then probably I got out of high school in 67, and about 1971, I went over to Boise, and I had plans of having the military teach me how to fly.
Right.
And they told me that I wasn't a good physical specimen for their needs. So they sent me home. And so I kind of gave up wanting to learn to fly because I didn't think I could pass a flight physical. And so anyway, probably in about 78 or 79, my dad had got sick. So Bud Stangl flew him to Portland. And he said, you just will go along. And so I remember on the way back, he said, well, why don't you fly my airplane? And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. And he said, well, just steer for that hill over there. So I did, and I found out, well, this is kind of fun.
Yeah.
And so I joined the flying club, Chief Joseph Flyers. And at that time, there were over 40 members in the club. And they had 4 airplanes. They had a 150, 2 172s, and a 182 at the time I joined. And the 150 was $10 an hour, and the instructor was at $10 an hour. And so it was actually probably one of the cheapest places to learn to fly is in Enterprise. And at that time, I was driving truck, and
Driving log trucks?
yes. And in fact, Harold, the guy that I was working for, had transitioned. He was transitioning away. He transitioned to hauling agricultural products. And so he bought this outfit called Farm Supply Distributors, and which is still going today. And so I did that for a couple of 3 years. And then I decided I didn't want to keep driving truck. I wanted to fly. I ended up going to Texas and went to a place down there at Fort Worth, and that was, I forgot what year, 1980, 81. So I went down there and got my commercial instrument and flight instructor ticket, and I couldn't wait to get back here to where there was real mountains.
Right.
I got in trouble. I was coming in to land at Fort Worth. The tower told me to report over Eagle Mountain. And I'm flying along pretty quick. He calls me and said, I thought I told you to report over Eagle Mountain. And why I said this, I don't know. But I just said, well, I haven't seen any mountain yet. So I don't know if they appreciated that because it was a little hill that was maybe 300 feet higher than the rest of the terrain. And they called it a mountain. But
well, Texans like to think that everything's bigger in Texas, but mountains are certainly not a good example of that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and then after that, I came back and started working for Stangles there in the shop, and then I did a little flight instructing. And then Bud had me flying scenic flights with one of his airplanes. And so I built some time up doing that. And then Stangles, Bud and Margaret wanted me to buy him out, and the banks at that time were real wary of the airplane business. And and I didn't really have any credit built up. So they said, well, we will finance you. And so they financed me. And I felt like they were just, well, they were special people. And otherwise, I don't think a person could have got going in business. And that's what it usually takes, is somebody that is willing to help you along the way. And so that's how I got started. And as I was taking over, Bud said, I'll show you how to really fly. So I felt like I was pretty privileged to have somebody like Bud take me into some of these places. And he did that for a lot of these guys that are around here.
Mm-hmm.
He showed them how to get into some of the more challenging places. And so I felt privileged doing that. And then he was retiring, and so somebody had to do the game census flights. So he helped get me going on that, showed me what he did, and so that really worked out well.
And game census is flying around looking for deer and elk and counting them and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you ever do species other than deer and elk?
Oh, yeah.
Bighorn sheep?
Bighorn sheep, goats, cougars.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and bear. You'd see bear.
Yeah.
But cougar are really hard to find because they're pretty sneaky, just like a house cat hiding looking for a mouse.
Right.
Just a bigger variety. And so usually, though, if you saw elk staring at something and not paying attention to us, we figured there was probably a bear or cougar out there.
Yeah.
And back then, we didn't have any wolves in this area. Just most of the predators we found were coyotes and cougar and bear.
Were there more deer and elk then, or fewer? What's changed? You've been flying around here looking at critters for a long time.
When I first started, there were lots of elk. The deer population was a lot better. We didn't have the numbers of whitetail that we have now.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big change. And the mule deers, the numbers have gone down, I think.
Yeah.
Elk numbers, the last couple of years we did game census that I did it, and the numbers had dropped dramatically. Snake River was down. The Cessna and Zumwalt counts were up. The Minam, Wanaha, most of those places were all down.
Yeah.
And we did a predator study a number of years ago, and it was mostly cougar and bear that were eating the young.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a study they did. I did that for about 5 years.
Yeah. So you've, experienced aviation in a lot of ways through a bunch of different wars, with that first gentleman being trained in World War I. And, each of these wars has a big impact on aviation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how have you seen that change over time from the influence of the Korean War pilots and the World War II pilots, Vietnam, and now these modern generation wars? How has that changed aviation?
I think the biggest impact that I would say the Gulf War has had a big impact, because that's when GPS really started changing how people navigated. GPS originally was just military, and then people began to find out. And we used Loran for a while, and that was a big change in technology.
What was Loran?
Long-range navigation. and it's ground based.
Okay.
There's a station up at George Washington. There was, I forget where the others. There's one in Nevada, and they used what they call chains. We had I forget what our chain was, but I flew to Libby, Montana one time, and coming back, I knew where Enterprise was, but it kept telling me to go east about 20 miles.
Oh, really?
And so that was one of the problems with Loran.
It wasn't perfect.
It wasn't perfect. And but if you're just flying around here, it was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I could fly to Portland and back, or to Boise and back, or wherever, and it would be pretty spot on.
Mm-hmm.
But if you went into another place where it had a different chain, then it would not be very accurate.
Gotcha.
An example of that was a guy from Chicago had a P-51. That's a World War II fighter, and these guys get him now and fix them all up. And he had flown to Seattle, and on the way back, he was intending to land in Lewiston for fuel. Well, he was getting really low on fuel, and here he was circling Enterprise, and he saw the airport, and so he needed fuel. He lit. That was a pretty exciting day to see a P-51 land at Enterprise. And so Bud was able to show him how to change the chain so he could have more accurate navigation. And I forget what year that was. That was in the late 80s. And so then in probably in 92, I'm guessing maybe 94, that's when GPS started.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't real accurate, but it was better than Loran because it was satellite based. So that's one of the big changes I've seen as far as military influence. A lot of the Vietnam pilots supplied most of the helicopter jobs for a number of years. Most of those guys are probably getting pretty long in the tooth now, but I know even back when I was logging, we had Vietnam pilots flying the logging helicopters, and some of them were a little bit wild. And they had to calm them down a little bit because they were going to get somebody hurt. But
right. They really liked flying close to the ground and closer than they needed to a lot of times.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was rappelling and fighting fire, there was definitely a big contingent of the Vietnam pilots that were still in commercial aviation, and I think there still are. But some of the Vietnam guys, they just could not help but fly map of the earth. And I remember we had to rappel and get this guy just over the California border from Reno, and he'd been in a four-wheeler accident and had broken some ribs. And it wasn't too bad. I think he had like broken ribs and broken arm or something like that. Didn't have a punctured lung, wasn't going to die. He needed a ride to the hospital, but he needed a comfortable ride. And this pilot, man, he was back in Vietnam mode, and he was just right over the treetops, and it was a really rough flight. I kept telling him, like, we just need smooth right now. Like, we're going plenty fast enough. And then the other unrelated but kind of wild thing about that is we were in too big of a helicopter to land on top of the hospital. So we had to land in the playground right next to it. And, of course, as soon as you try and land a helicopter on kids, they just come flocking to it. And I had to bail out when we were still in the air and kind of corral kids away from the tail rotor and everything else. But, yeah, those guys were really incredible pilots, but it was a unique flying style for sure.
Yeah. And I can remember some of those guys, well, like I say, when we were still logging, those guys, they would race each other. Who's going to get the most logs to the deck in the shortest period of time. But during the flying for fires for the Forest Service, we had a lot of guys that were really sharp. Mm-hmm. And we had one guy, he had been shot down in Vietnam a couple of times, and he was flying on a contract for the Forest Service. The helicopter at that time, we didn't have really good communications or a way to pinpoint where we were, so we called in every 15 minutes our location.
Mm-hmm.
And so this one guy, his name was Rick, he didn't call in on his 15-minute call in. The half hour went by, and I got a call and said, can we go look? So hurried up, put fuel in the airplane, we took off, and we started searching. And I said, there's a pond here and there's a pond there. So we looked at those ponds, and we found one of the ponds with a helicopter in it upside down. Well, that was pretty scary.
Right.
And so anyway, we made a low pass or two, and the pilot was laying there on the shore
Mm-hmm.
above the water, and he waved at us. So we knew he was alive, but
Yeah.
his helicopter was upside down in the water. And it was a power plant failure.
Oh.
And basically, the governor had a line break, which told the engine didn't need power. And so it went to idle, and of course, down he went and rolled over in the water. And he, in the crash, he broke his back. And so that was kind of the end of he'd had it. He said that was enough. But he said he'd been shot down twice in Vietnam. So I don't know. That was kind of the end of the Vietnam type flying for him. So
What kind of hard landings have you been a part of?
let's see. Can't really think of anything other than landing down at Pittsburgh Landing, and windsock looked like it was calm. And it was rougher than a Cobb.
And that's down there in Hell's Canyon.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I had a veterinarian with me, and supposedly they had emergency. The horse had a big cut on his leg, and they were all shook up because the horse was hurt. So I felt like I had to get down there. Well, it was just rougher than a Cobb going in there, and the vet that was with me does not like to fly. And so anyway, we get in there, and it was one of those deals where the wind, I didn't know it was that gusty. Wind was not doing anything, and about the time I touched down, a gust of wind caught me and just picked me up and then dropped me. And there's a big ditch at the end of that strip. And so I thought, man, I'm going to go in the ditch, and I didn't want to do that. So I tried to turn, and the fork came off the front of the airplane. It's kind of like riding a bicycle down the hill and putting the front brake on. And it just kind of flopped upside down, I thought it was going to be just fine, and in slow motion, went upside down. So I had all the vet's gear tied down. Good thing.
Yeah.
We get all of that out, and he went to work on the horse, and I looked at my airplane and thought, well, we're not going to fly out of here.
Right.
And kind of an interesting thing, when it went upside down, it pushed the wing a little bit enough that I couldn't open the door.
Oh.
And I shut the master switch off, and I shut the fuel off. And upside down, it's really hard to reach that fuel valve. So anyway, I went to open the door, and it wouldn't open.
Mm-hmm.
And I broke the hinges on it getting out of there. I wanted out. Because I've heard a lot of stories that the crash is survivable, but they're pinned in, and the airplane catches fire.
Right.
And so I wanted out of that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I broke the door hinge off, and of course, the vet clinic had the pictures posted there for a number of years. And everybody knew about it, so.
Well, how many hours have you flown at this point?
A little over 20,000.
20,000. So that is 20,000 hours would be 833 days in the air.
Hadn't thought of that.
So you've spent years in the air, mostly in Wallowa County, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think one little, flipping in there, playing upside down, and everybody being okay, and that's not too bad.
No, but it's still one of them things you don't want to do.
Yeah, yeah. But you've seen a lot of other people crash in that time.
Yeah, I've known a lot of guys that crashed.
How does that affect you as a pilot, as a professional pilot, when other aviators, crash and live, crash and die?
It just makes you realize you got to be careful.
Yeah.
And a number of years ago, back around, probably was that 2000, I think the fall of 2000, a fellow over at Baker was flying, disappeared, and they did a lot of searching and stuff. But I couldn't get out of here. We were fogged in Enterprise for probably a month, and they never did find him until the next spring. And a rancher was up repairing fence up on this, I think they call it Sturgill Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked down and he saw the remains of this airplane, and it had crashed. And the guy that was doing it, he had a lot of time in the Midwest flying freight, like hauling mail and freight and stuff. But he wasn't experienced in flying in the mountains and stuff. And in fact, I ended up flying for the same outfit because they couldn't find him. And they wanted me to do things that you couldn't do. And they weren't very happy that because I refused to get down where they wanted me to. They didn't want to use the Cub. They wanted to use the big plane because they always had 2 or 3 people going along. And fortunately, with the fellow from Baker, it was just him and the one biologist. And so he didn't have a whole plane load of people. But that kind of makes you stop and think. And then even this last year, a very experienced pilot from Lewiston ended up having a mid-air collision up by Coeur d'Alene. And so there were a number of people involved that were killed in that. So it kind of makes you realize that you just have to it's like one guy told me, you got to be like a hootie owl, just keep looking all around.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you ever find yourself getting complacent and skipping steps and then you kind of got to rein yourself back in again, or are you pretty good about that?
Well, I have to admit that there are times, especially if you get really tired, you get complacent.
Yeah.
And so you have to just tell yourself, be careful, be careful.
What are some of the more challenging places around here to land in? I assume you don't like going back to Pittsburgh landing.
Not with that airplane.
Not with that airplane.
It's fine you could go in there if it's cool,
mm-hmm.
but if it's hot, I've gone in there when it was 110 degrees, and that was an emergency. There was a boat that they called it a bilge explosion. And there was 13 people, as I recall, on board this pretty good sized boat there. And it was on the Idaho side of Pittsburgh. And they went to start the engine, and most of the people on there were, it was like a severe sunburn.
Oh.
But 2 of the people I remember that time were burned very bad. I probably shouldn't say this, but it was bad enough that the skin was coming off.
Yeah. So they just hadn't turned their blowers on, and they had a bunch of fumes
right.
in the.
Yep.
So it was a inboard jet boat, and and then it blew up when they cranked it.
So I went in and I picked up 3 guys, and I wasn't sure we were going to get out of there because it just kept getting hotter and hotter during the day, and so I loaded up 3 guys and took them to Lewiston, and the ambulance met us there in Lewiston. But these guys were in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And the part that bothered me was the people that were burned really bad couldn't feel it.
Yep.
They didn't have any feeling.
Yeah.
So, and they were in shock.
Sure.
So that was one time that I went in there. It was pretty challenging, but it was an emergency, and I just figured, well, come to the end of the strip, it's gonna fly. I mean, because there's a 20-foot drop off, and so we were able to do that. I didn't have a full load of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
But Bynum can be challenging. That's one of them places that even last summer I had guests that were supposed to be in there, and I went in and I looked at that windsock, and it was going back and forth, and it was pretty rough. And I just turned around and I came home.
Yeah.
And I felt kind of bad because there was no place around Enterprise for these people to stay.
Right.
They had to go back to Elgin to find a place to stay. So, I mean, that's just, when it's like that, you just don't go.
Well, it takes a lot of courage to be able to say no to a bad situation. And I think that's a critical trait for somebody in your profession to have.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's one of those places. There's places you can land with a Cub or something like that, but with the 206 or anything, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I mean, Minum can be a piece of cake in the morning,
right,
when it's cool and things like that. But in the mid-afternoon, it can be pretty challenging.
Have you ever run into a situation where you kind of had to bob and weave around that canyon to find some air that could get you up?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
That's kind of canyon flying.
Yeah. So describe that technique.
Well, you just have to kind of hunt for a place where the air is going to push you up, and if it's really hot, the other thing you got to consider is your engine, because if it's 100 degrees and you're trying to climb, you may not be able to climb. You might just be able to keep going down the canyon because you got to keep that engine cool.
Yeah.
You got to keep air flowing over it. And so if you try to climb at, say, 90 miles an hour instead of 100, your engine's going to get hot.
Right.
But yet it would climb at 90, but you can't climb at 100. So it's just one of those things. You just have to hunt back and forth across the canyon and see if you can find some air that'll help lift you up.
And then with that, if you've got air coming up in the canyon, as soon as it goes over that next ridge, it's probably going to be dropping a little bit, right? So you've got to get it up plenty high enough that you don't get sucked down on the other side.
Yep. And the way I was taught is you come at a ridge, say around a 45-degree angle to the ridge, and you all the time you're trying to feel what the air's going to do. And then when you get ready to go over the ridge, turn and parallel to it. And if you can't feel that going up, just go on down pretty quick. You'll find a place where it's going to be lower, and then you can cross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's such a fascinating thing, and most people don't get to fly in mountains. And certainly not places like this where, we change 9,000 feet of elevation in 40 miles.
Right.
This is a very special place as far as verticality goes, and the way the wind moves through this country is pretty special as well.
You get what they call a Venturi effect in canyons. And Hurricane Creek is well named because if you have a 20-knot wind coming across from the southwest, and Hurricane Creek is lying pretty much north and south, or somewhat, if you're headed north, it's actually a northeast, it will actually increase to maybe 30. And when it does that, it creates a low pressure area, and your airplanes get in that deal, and down it goes. And I know one time I had a biologist, and she kept wanting to get down closer, and I told her I didn't think it was a good idea, but I would try it. So I came down and got down below the ridge, and all of a sudden I had pencils floating on the ceiling. and I just came right on down the canyon and headed home. And she says, "I'm not done." And I said, "Yeah, I am." So,
Oh man. Well, I think it's important to bring up that we are currently sitting at the Joseph Airport, and Hurricane Creek is about 150 yards away from us right now. It's an interesting approach to land at this airport because you basically fly straight towards a damn mountain with a huge drainage on both sides of it, and in your final turn, you're right out over the top of that thing.
yep.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
A little bit intimidating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's sometimes, it's kind of nice having two airports close together. We have Enterprise Airport's about 3.5 nautical miles north of us. And there are times there that the wind's blowing really bad and Joseph won't have any wind. But a lot of times Joseph will have nasty winds coming out of the southwest, pretty strong crosswinds. You can also get some wind shear. But you can go to Enterprise and there won't be any wind. So I don't know why it's like that, but it's kind of handy.
Yeah. What is wind shear?
Wind shear is a thing where, for instance, landing in a place where you have a bunch of trees, you'll have wind that you're coming into above the trees, and as you're coming in, all of a sudden the trees break the wind, and your airspeed will change dramatically in just a few seconds. So,
and what does airspeed mean to an airplane?
It means life.
Right. It means everything.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what makes the dream work.
Yep. That's a good example of some wind shear. Probably 25, 30 years ago, there was I forget what kind of plane it was. It was a commercial jet. Had a lot of passengers on board coming into, I forget, one of the places in Texas. They were coming in to land, and there was a thunderstorm in the area. And anytime you have a thunderstorm in the area, you can always have what they call wind shear. And the jet was coming in to land. He had a headwind, and all of a sudden, it became a tailwind. So that's a wind shear. And the result was disastrous. The airplane just suddenly dropped out of the air, and not enough room to recover, and they crashed.
Man, scary stuff. But, flying has also been one of these just monumental improvements for the way humans are able to transport themselves, and such a recent invention, right?
Yep.
Like we're just getting the stuff figured out, kind of, right?
Yep.
Where do you see aviation advancing? Like, so many of these airplanes are old, they're ancient airplanes, but we keep rebuilding all the parts that wear out and keep using them. So in some ways it's changed very little, but in other ways it's changed a lot. Talk to me about that.
Well, one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of ancient airplanes that keep getting rebuilt is because some of these new airplanes are anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. And 30 to 40 years ago, you could buy the same airplane for $30,000.
Right.
And even though in those, 30 years ago, and let's say 1980, that's 40 years ago. Those are relatively new airplanes, what they're flying now. There's airplanes that are built in the 30s and the 40s that are still flying commercially, like a DC-3.
Right.
There's nothing today that's affordable that'll do what they do. And they have a real good safety record. So you can put a lot of money into an old airplane to bring it up to standards compared to the cost of a new airplane today. The other big change I see is what they call drones. I don't know. I was just reading about this outfit in Pendleton. There's a lot of experimentation they're doing with drones. And these machines, I don't know what they cost, but they're about the size of a Cessna 150. And, they're big enough you could almost ride in them, except they're not built that way. And the guy sits on the ground, and he's able to, with the cameras on board, he can fly that thing just like he was flying an airplane, but he sits on the ground flying it. And for certain things, you're not risking somebody's life doing that.
Yeah. So for the jobs that don't require somebody to be in the seat, that's a smart thing to do. Like if we're just trying to get images of something or take weather samples.
Right.
There's a lot of jobs that drones can do. We actually used you'll have to help me out. It was the helicopter with 2 main rotor blades and no tail rotor. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Like a Vertol or a Chinook?
No. The rotor blades look like they're like a blender kind of.
Yeah.
Looks like they're going to eat each other.
Like a K-Max.
K-Max. Yeah, it was a K-Max. Damnedest looking helicopter. They're pretty cool. Real thin, heavy lift helicopter. We had a K-Max in Afghanistan that was unmanned, and they were doing load missions with it. So you need to fly gear out to a place where more than likely going to get shot at. Why risk the pilot in addition to the aircraft?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting thing. Do you think we'll get to a point where some of our commercial jets will be unmanned?
Well, they say they are.
Yeah.
That makes me nervous.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd ride in it if nobody's up there in the cockpit. I don't know if I'd like that.
Would you know?
Probably not.
Yeah. Kind of interesting. No, it's an exciting future. Even just a couple years ago, these glass cockpits, that had all these panels and gauges and looked so pretty. In a lot of ways, they can get replaced by an iPad that costs $1,000.
Yeah.
And some of those glass cockpits, how much did those things cost? Over $100,000?
Yep.
Yeah. So, we're kind of seeing things that were very expensive go back the other way and become more accessible. I think there's people out there that don't understand that there are aircraft that they can affordably buy and go fly and have a good time in. So what are some of those, and what do some of those airplanes cost these days?
You can still buy, there's what they called an Aeronca Champ. They were a trainer that was popular right after World War II. And all these little companies, Piper, Aeronca, I can't think of some of the other, Stinson was another one. They started mass producing these airplanes because all these pilots are coming back from World War II. And so we're going to have an airplane available for all these guys that come back from the war. They figured, and to some extent that was true. But one fellow that I knew, when he got through with World War II, he was he's qualified to fly a B-17. It never did leave the United States because the war was over before he ever got any place.
Terrific airplane.
Yeah.
B-17 was an important airplane.
It was. And so he was qualified to fly that. He got out of the service. He was going to be a flight instructor, but all these other guys were too. And he told me he just kind of gave up flying because he had to feed his family.
Yeah. And
so anyway, all these companies kind of went broke almost because they mass produced. They couldn't sell them then because everybody was competing, and they just too many out there, and there's a glut in the market. So,
and there's still a lot of those around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can still find J3 Cubs, although now they're considered classics, so the price has gone up. There's still a few Stinsons around that you can get those. Relatively inexpensive.
So what does that mean? Like, if you were to buy a Stinson that you could get in and fly and like, had decent hours on it, what would that cost?
Well, I haven't looked at any prices lately, but for a while you could buy one of those Stinsons for about 30,000. That was a pretty nice airplane.
Yeah.
Cessna 150, that's still a pretty good airplane you can buy for, I'm guessing, between 25 and 30, So
I'd have to lose about 100 pounds to get in one of those things, I think. Just like cut off one arm, one leg, get a little bit narrower.
Yeah, they're cozy.
Yeah. I think that's where the term elbow room came from, and why it's not called elbows room, because there's only room for one elbow at a time. No, the 150, I mean, that's trained just hundreds of thousands of pilots.
Yep.
Like, that's a
and for a while,
classic airplane.
Yeah, that back, probably 20 years ago, the price really started going up on 150s because some of these foreign countries were buying them up.
Yeah.
Because they were using them for training their people.
Right.
And many years ago, I met a guy from Ghana, and he'd been in the Ghana Air Force. And that's what he had, his first airplane to fly was a Cessna 150.
Yeah.
As a trainer, primary trainer, and then the next one he went to was a de Havilland of some kind. But and then basically most of the aircraft that he flew were de Havilland. But
yeah, when I was in Kodiak this fall, it's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of Alaska, is backcountry bush flying, and big bush wheels and landing out there on the tundra or wherever. But on Kodiak, you can't land on vegetation anywhere. So it's all water to water, or for the main. There's a couple of airstrips. I think there's some gravel bars, and then there's the main airport there. But no, it's mostly a float plane show to get around. There's quite a few lakes on the island, and they were using de Havilland beavers.
Oh yeah,
gosh, they're a cool airplane. I was so excited just to be around one. I'd never got to see one before. Pretty incredible.
But they're expensive to operate.
Yeah.
They don't go fast.
Yep.
And they burn lots of gas.
Yeah.
But there's not anything else that'll do the job they do.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Put quite a bit of gear and people in them, and they just seem tough. It seemed like a tough aircraft.
Yep.
And those haven't been made for a long time.
No. I think they quit manufacturing them probably around 1960.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Now you're rebuilding an airplane right now.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that little project. Not that little of a project.
No. That's kind of one of them embarrassing things. Yeah, I bought the airplane. I wanted to use it for a backup, and it just started out. From the looks of the airplane, it looked real good, and I knew that I was going to be replacing the motor. I had planned on that. The avionics, I was figuring on changing those, and everything else seemed like a pretty solid airplane. And I did fly it. I probably put, I'm guessing, around 6-7 hours on it. But the alternator quit working. And so I brought it up to get the alternator fixed. And people kept coming in and looking at things and saying, "Oh, what's wrong here? This doesn't look good." And pretty quick, I had a rebuild project.
Yeah. So, it's all torn apart now, but coming back together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully this spring we'll have it going again.
And what kind of airplane is it?
It's actually a 182, a 1957 182. And so when we put it back together, it'll be a 57, 58, 59, 60. So what happened is there was a fellow lives up in, I think he's in Barrow, Alaska. And So he wanted an airplane, and so he's wanting to make two airplanes out of one. So he bought this airplane, had a good motor, and the motor wasn't hurt, but it had a hard landing out in the tundra. And so he bought the salvage of it, and I've been able to use a lot of pieces off of it that he doesn't need to put on this airplane. So it saved quite a bit of money, and so anyway, it was a 60, so we'll have a kind of a combination 57 and a 60 together. So
Cool.
yeah,
That'll be fun. It'll be fun to finally get it back together and fly again. It's amazing to see kind of how simple these machines actually are when they're all taken apart, and they really need to be simple, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have done the work without Ken and a young fellow by the name of Isaac. And Isaac is, he's 17, and he just has a mechanical mind, and I couldn't have done it without him.
That's cool.
He's just a neat kid and loves doing it. So
yeah. What kind of backcountry repairs have you had to kind of patch together on airplanes over the years?
Oh, luckily I haven't had to do anything out in the brush.
Not for anybody else?
Well, yeah, that.
Yeah.
We had a fellow from, I forget where he was from, and but he lit out at Lord Flat, and I can't remember what kind of airplane it was. But anyway, he lit out there, and it was some kind of an Aeronca, and he bounced it, and when he went up, the oleo strut came apart, and when he came down, the thing was apart, and so he just hit on a wing, and it scooted it around, and he wasn't going any place. So a bunch of us went out there to help him, and they ended up having to drill a couple of holes in the sheet metal and wrap chains around the spars, and they hired this helicopter outfit from over at Riggins, I guess. They're from Riggins.
Mm-hmm.
And so they got them to come in and pick that airplane up and haul it back to actually, I think they took it back over to Pittsburgh Landing.
Oh, really?
Either there or they might have taken it. Anyway, wherever they took it so they could get a trailer to it and take the wings off. But they flew it out of there from Lord Flat. It was kind of hard luck, but
that's got to be interesting from the helicopter pilot's perspective, having an airplane with wings underneath of him that's trying to fly around as he's going.
Yep. We had to tape 2x4s to the wings so it kills the lift.
Oh, you tape them to the bottom?
To the top.
And to the top.
Yep.
Okay.
Otherwise it kills it. If you don't, the thing will try to fly, and that can be pretty disastrous.
Yeah.
And
it's a lot of pressure.
Well, if the helicopter is trying to take this airplane out and it tries to start flying, the helicopter pilot, all he can do is just jettison.
Right.
And then you really got a problem.
Yeah.
So
yeah, she's not coming back from that one.
Yep. Yeah, it was a rebuildable airplane. He wasn't going to fly it out of there.
Have you seen any interesting things with wildlife and doing all these wildlife surveys?
Yeah. We talked about cougars, and a couple of different times I've watched cougars hiding from the elk, but the elk knew they were there. And I was flying with one fellow, and I said, "There's a cat." And so we went out around and came back, and here was this cat hiding behind a log, and he was stretched out, the tail sticking straight back, and you could see him watching those elk, and the elk were watching him. They knew he was there. And so we buzzed him 2 or 3 times, and he finally got up and left, but spoiled his breakfast for that morning, probably.
Yeah, gave an elk another day to live, though, so that's
right.
Fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. Well, you've had quite a career here, and you've helped so many people, so many young people get into flying, and the most important flight lesson I ever took was with you, and we talked about it this morning, but the instructor that I'd been working with was, he'd take away the controls all the time. So whenever something was going slightly wrong, instead of giving you a chance to fix it, he'd just kind of grab the controls and get you back on track. So I sort of had the illusion that I knew how to land, and I really didn't. And when we came around the mountain here and we're on final to come land here at Joseph, I was pretty long on the runway. Like I was not going to land on the numbers or anywhere close to it, and I thought we were just going to have to try again. And I was getting pretty nervous about it, and you said, there's plenty of runway. I'm not going to let you kill me. You just try and figure it out. And I did, and it was just a great experience for you to kind of help me with that and give me that confidence and make me do it on my own. And you've done that for so many people, and you've shown so many people this beautiful part of the world and kept them safe in doing it, and hauled people out when they were hurt or needed help. You're just a legend, and I think it's pretty cool to be able to fly with you and hear all the stories, and a couple years of your life you've spent in the air in this place that most people can't fly in at all.
Yeah,
it's an amazing thing, Joe. So I appreciate your time here today. If somebody wants to come out here and fly with you, how do they get a hold of you?
Probably just call the house or call my cell phone. I don't know.
Just search for Joe Spence Aviation.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, sir, and I hope you continue to stay safe and look forward to seeing you fluttering around in this new airplane.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. This episode was edited by Emily Brannigan, with original music written and performed by Justin Hay. Artwork for the Six Ranch podcast was created by John Chatterlin and digitized by Celia Christofferson. If you enjoyed the show, I encourage you to share it with a friend and subscribe. You can find photos and more content on Instagram at Six Ranch Podcast. I'll catch you next week.